All right.
60 minutes, I will be moderating this debate, or at least strongly felt conversation. The director of the Libertarian Institute, Scott Horton, is a radio host and author. Scott's most recent book, published this year, Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Great. Neil Ferguson is a historian and author, and like me, a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Neil's most recent book, published in 2021, Doom,
So good.
The Politics of Catastrophe. Two men with catastrophe in your most recent titles. This will be cheerful. Neil is currently working on the second volume of his biography of Henry Kissinger. I should note that as all the world learned when 60 Minutes aired this past Sunday, Neil is also a trustee at the new University of Austin in Texas. Our format, the format I have in mind, object if you wish to, either of you right up at the top, is simple and conversational. I'll ask one or the other of you a question, giving you plenty of time to reply. Once one or the other has replied, the other gets a chance to reply in turn, and then on to the next question. You should feel completely free to talk to each other, ask each other questions. If you start to talk over each other, I'll intercede. Otherwise, I'll stay out of it. Fair?
Sure.
Sounds very fair.
Very fair. All right. 3 sentences of background. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, part of Ukraine. Then in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, moving not just on Eastern Ukraine, but bombing sites across the country, and sending troops all the way to the capital city of Kyiv.
Hopefully you can.
The invasion failed, but Russia has occupied about 1/5 of the territory of Ukraine, holding Crimea and much of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Today, it seems to me fair to say that the conflict has settled into a war of attrition. For Scott Horton, who started it? Scott, you have condemned the invasion of Ukraine, but as you argue in the title of your book, it was provoked. I'll come in a moment to the detailed expansion of NATO step by step and have you take us through that. But if you could give an overview statement of the ways in which you believe Russia was provoked.
This guy
Well,
is a complete
to go
douchebag.
back to the way you originally stated, was who started
This is
it.
why I'm watching this.
The point is that American policy has made the answer to that question very complicated and not just clear-cut. So, of course, no one's denying that Putin and his men made a decision, well, Putin himself and his men obeying him, made a decision to escalate the war by 10,000% in February of 2022 with a massive invasion, as I say, a catastrophe for Ukraine since then. So there's no question about what happened there. And I mean, frankly, I don't think there's much question that Russian forces were involved in the civil war after it broke out in the summer of 2014 and a little bit later in early 2015. But now as you expanded the question, the antecedents, right? And this is what the great historian Robert Higgs said about World War II, is they always truncate the antecedents. So my job is going back and elongating them. So the book starts with H.W. Bush and the end of the last Cold War, and before Bill Clinton ever came to town. The plan always was to expand NATO at Russia's expense, but to lie to them, to tell them that we're not going to expand NATO, or if we do, it won't matter because NATO won't be a military alliance anymore. It'll be a political organization, and we're going to create a new partnership for peace, and you and Ukraine will be in it. So Ukraine will be neutral and Russia will be a full partner because there's no threat. We don't need an alliance. All we need is a security partnership arrangement, and we'll have a common European home and everything will be fine. But they were lying all along. They knew that that was not the plan. The plan was always to use the CSCE and the Partnership for Peace as a halfway house, essentially, toward NATO membership. They knew they had to essentially shine Yeltsin on, Gorbachev and then Yeltsin on.
But when you say they knew, you're talking about successive American administrations, correct?
Well, even in the H.W. Bush administration, they began
the moderator
knowing
knows
that
his
they would
shit.
have to let the Russians
And Neil
believe that
knows
we,
his shit.
as Bush's solemn promise, we will not take advantage of your withdrawal from Eastern Europe.
Okay,
And
could I pause you there, because
Sure.
I'll come right back to you, because
No
this
problem.
detailed history, which
look at that.
each administration successively expanding NATO, we have to go into that. I'll return to you, but Neil, the overall, Scott has given us his theme. What's yours?
Well, let's just dismiss the notion that there was a promise not to enlarge NATO, shall we? This originates in a conversation that Jim Baker had with Mikhail Gorbachev in February 1990, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in that conversation, Baker asked, would you prefer to see a united Germany outside of NATO, independent and with no US forces, or would you prefer a unified Germany to be tied to NATO, with assurances that NATO's jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position? Baker's words.
Correct.
Gorbachev said that he would prefer the latter. Baker seemed to agree. But when he went back to DC, Secretary Baker was given an earful by President George H.W. Bush, who said, to hell with that. We prevailed and they didn't. We can't let the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat. And that was the end of not one
Feels
inch.
a little laggy today.
So when Putin, as he repeatedly has claimed, says that there was a promise, that isn't actually good history. It
Well,
was
actually,
something
it
that
is.
Baker, if I may finish, it was something that Baker discussed with Gorbachev, but never became the policy of the Bush administration, because Bush never for 1 second countenanced it. Secondly, and this is the thing that people like Scott tend to miss, there are other actors in the drama besides Russia and the United States. The former Warsaw Pact
It's
members
an impossible task
and
here.
Soviet republics had an interest and agency too, and they wanted to be in NATO. They did not want some alternative security arrangement, for the very good reason that they understood, Lech Wałęsa, for example, the Polish leader, that anything less than NATO would not give them security. So this is the reality, that the countries that joined NATO were not forced into it by the United States. They wanted to join NATO, and the United States was not really in a position to decline their request. There was, of course, a heated debate at the time. There were those, George Kennan, for example, who argued that NATO enlargement was a mistake. But it was the policy of the US government, of successive presidents, beginning with George H.W. Bush, and crucially, to my mind, it was what the Central and East Europeans wanted.
Scott, back to you. Yeah. Could we, so...
Can I address what you just said there real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so on the last point, no one ever argued that America forced the Eastern European countries to join. Of course they wanted to join. The question was, why would America do what they wanted instead of what was good for America's national interest, which was, as Kennan and Buchanan and so many others warned at the time, was making sure that our relationship with Moscow was copacetic. Who cares about Warsaw? What matters is that we get along with the Russians for the long term, and they're sacrificing that much more important long-term good for the short-term interests, including what the Eastern European nations wanted. But on the previous point, pardon me, but that is just bad history. Yes, you're right about the one meeting between Baker and Gorbachev on February the 9th, but there were numerous meetings, and I demonstrate this in my book. I have 7,800 citations, and including hundreds on this topic.
Okay, there were several meetings,
this all began in Malta.
Was it ever written down?
When H.W. Bush promised Gorbachev himself, the president promised, we will not take advantage of your withdrawal at all. That was it. And Jack Matlock, the second to last ambassador to the USSR, has explained that, including personally to me, that was all-encompassing. And you mentioned others involved. How about Genscher? How about Robert Gates made the same promise to the head of the KGB the same day that Baker was making that offer to Gorbachev? And how about the fact that Genscher, who was the foreign minister of Germany, West Germany, just as much a partner in all this, repeatedly vowed that NATO would not expand not only into Eastern Germany, but to any nation east of Germany either. And in the final treaty that they did sign, what they did was they came up with, because you're right that Bush said that Baker's plan made no sense. How can you bring Germany into NATO, but not, or reunify Germany, but not have East Germany into NATO? Even just as a sentence, it doesn't make sense. So what they decided was, of course, East Germany will be part of NATO, but we promise not to expand any of our military presence into the former GDR. Now, if the deal always was that, of course, we can bring Poland and the Baltics into NATO next and put bases there, then why would it matter if we were allowed to put troops in Eastern Germany? The entire, and pardon me, one more thing, the entire discussion, and this is shown by scholars like Shifrinson and Surratt and others, it was the promises that Genscher and Baker made to Gorbachev, that it was based on those promises that he decided to allow reunification. It was, and Mary Elise Surratt proves this better than anyone in her book, Not One Inch. As soon as he said, well, of course, I guess that's up to you, they pounced. Didn't matter that it wasn't in a treaty, it was just his spoken words. They said, okay, I guess we'll allow reunification, and they went for it. And it was based on these solemn vows that we will not take advantage. And again, they lied. And they said repeatedly that they're going to turn NATO into a political organization, sort of like the EU plus America. But we're going to replace it as a military institution with the CSCE and later the Partnership for Peace. And that was to deceive. Under Bush and under Bill Clinton, they said that to the Russians to get them to acquiesce when they knew all along the plan was to expand the military alliance right up to their border. That's the real history of what happened there, sir.
Interesting.
Okay, boys, we spent 10 minutes on this first question, but on the other hand, the first question is a tremendously important one. Conversations took place. At a minimum, Scott has laid this out. Neil has readily grants the conversation between James Baker and Gorbachev, saying not 1 inch eastward. So, Neil, what if the United States? There are two questions, honestly, Scott. If we were lying, why were we lying? Why were we acting in other than our interest? What motive do you ascribe? But you get to that second. First, I want to come to Neil.
At JM Bullion, excellent service and competitive pricing aren't just goals. They're our standard.
Okay,
our
I do
commitment
not
to
condone
customer
this,
discretion and privacy with
ad.
secure and confidential
Whoever they're trying to
transactions
sell you, it's
has
probably
earned us an
bullshit.
unparalleled reputation as an online retailer of precious metals,
Okay, they
backed
just want
by
you to
over
sell.
375,000
I don't know how
reviews,
everybody makes a profit on
averaging
that.
4.8 out of 5 stars.
I
Only at
recommend
JM
buying
Bullion.
Ripple coin.
Neil, did we intentionally mislead, or even inadvertently mislead, Gorbachev and then Yeltsin?
Well, there was a succession of conversations. No commitment was ever made not to expand NATO. And indeed, when the issue came up during Boris Yeltsin's presidency, President Clinton explicitly said that the inclusion of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic former Soviet republics, would be something that Russia would be compensated for with membership of Western institutions, including the Group of Seven. So there was nothing mendacious or secretive about what was being discussed.
Hey, hamster, you
Russia
have frag grenades?
This was in the mid-1990s, and in that conversation, as in all the conversations that are relevant here, which, as you say, Mary Serratti describes in her book, while there was a debate within Washington and a debate within Europe about the wisdom of including the East European countries in NATO, there was never any commitment, any binding commitment on the part of the United States not to do it. And I think, in a sense, this is all somewhat beside the point, because ultimately, NATO enlargement, as it unfolded, was not strongly resisted by Russia until the issues of Georgia and Ukraine arose, which is much later at the 2008 NATO conference in Bucharest. So we kind of don't want to waste too much time on the parts of NATO enlargement that the Russians didn't seriously contest, because those enlargements were not the cause or origin of the war, even in Russian propaganda. We're not dealing with the war in Eastern Europe now because Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia joined NATO. The reason that there's a war in Eastern Europe now is that the Russians claim that the inclusion of Ukraine in NATO was a casus belli.
So, Neil, let me put a similar question, but different. Since the war in Ukraine began, these are the latest statistics I was able to find scouring the web, the Russians have lost 120,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. And according to a spokesman for the American Defense Department, quote, Russian losses in just the first year of the war exceeded the total of all Soviet losses since the Second World War combined. What is Putin thinking? Make his motives, make this action comprehensible to us. What does he think he's doing?
Well, first of all, it's simply not the case that all of these Russian soldiers lost their lives, to say nothing of the many Ukrainians the Russians have killed. We don't know exactly how many, but it's certainly in the tens and possibly hundreds of thousands, did not die because of NATO enlargement. Let's be clear about that, because that's a red herring, and it's, I think, an integral part of Russian propaganda. We should be skeptical of that argument. The reasons, if you'll let me finish.
Everything you say is CIA propaganda, then, if the other side of the story is all Russian propaganda.
Scott, I'll come back to you.
It's such a cheap shot. I'm so sick of this. Hey, every time when I was right about Iraq and you were wrong about Iraq, that was Saddam Hussein's propaganda that I was repeating, and that was MI6 and CIA propaganda that you were repeating. Who was right about that one, Niall?
Shall we, it's pronounced Neil.
It's Neil.
Okay,
whatever.
The question.
Scott, I'll come back to
I was repeating Saddam
Neil.
Hussein's propaganda
What's up,
in
everybody?
2003.
Scott, that's Iraq. We're on Ukraine.
We're
We're on Ukraine. And Neil's talking. Go ahead, Neil.
If you could let me try to answer the question that Peter put. Putin regarded Ukraine.
Talk faster. You're wasting time.
This guy's
Perhaps
just
you could
rude.
learn some manners, Scott, and we could get further. Putin regarded a democratic, independent Ukraine, and Ukraine had been recognized as an independent state since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, as a major threat to his regime. Why? Because a Ukraine as successful as Poland would be an advertisement that there was an alternative way to the way that he intended to lead Russia, the Russian Federation, after he came to power. And there was a military dimension to the threat too. In 2014, Putin snuffed out a nationalist uprising against a corrupt president in Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and created mini puppet states in the Donbass. The problem with this operation was that it created an unsustainable position from a Russian perspective. Crimea wasn't secure, there were no good communications to Crimea, it was subject to blockade by the Ukrainians, and crucially, despite the weakness of the Western response to Putin's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's response in the subsequent 10 years was a rapid rearmament and improvement of its own military capabilities. By the end of 2020, it was clear that Ukraine was soon going to be able to pose a decisive military threat to the puppet states in Donbass, and potentially also a threat to Russia's Black Sea Fleet and Russia itself. And so, not only for political reasons, but also for military reasons, Putin came to the conclusion that he had to act. In order to prepare the ground for his aggression, he published an article on the historic unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples, a farrago of lies and misrepresentations designed to legitimize the annexation. Western policymakers failed to understand how serious Putin was and did nothing to deter him. Indeed, the arms shipments to Ukraine were reduced in 2021, sanctions were taken off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and every signal was sent from Washington that Putin did not need to fear a military response if he took further aggressive action in Ukraine. He did. He thought it would be easy. In February of 2022, he attempted a swift blitzkrieg-like operation that was designed to decapitate the Ukrainian state, overthrow Zelensky, and install the kind of pro-Russian government that had existed prior to 2014. And it failed. It failed completely. And it failed because the Ukrainian military really had improved sufficiently to repel this Russian aggression. They defeated the Russians in the Battle of Kiev, drove them back, and indeed by the fall of 2022 had Russian armies in full flight from outside Kharkiv and Kherson. And that is what happened.
Scott, so the notion here is not that the invasion of Ukraine took place not because we, the West broadly speaking, or the United States, provoked them, the Russians, but because we failed to deter them. We indicated too much softness, not too much hardness.
Yeah, that's what they say. And look, some of what he says is right, but it's a massive pile of lies by omission, mostly. Starting with anybody who says the truth about this or adds the additional context about this from anything but London and Washington's point of view is repeating the propaganda of the other side. That's what they try to say about Syria, and that's what they try to say about Libya, and that's what they try to say about Iraq, and that's what they try to say about Afghanistan. You're just repeating the propaganda of the enemy, and yet the dissidents were right about all of those, and the people who were repeating the point of view of Washington and London have done nothing but create disaster after disaster after disaster. So I'm not going to sit here and stand for Russian propaganda. I got accusations of that. I got 7,800 citations in my book.
Scott, Neil and I are not accusing you of repeating any propaganda. We're asking what you think. I'm granting that your book is a meticulous piece of work. Go ahead.
The only citations of Russians talking in there is either Russian media exposing something about the Russian state, or just directly conveying their statements because I'm saying here's what they said, not because I'm saying here's how you know it's true because they said it. I'm saying here's an example of a claim that they made.
Why did Putin go in when he did?
There's no Russian propaganda in any of my arguments. As he said,
I'm not accusing you of that. I'm asking you why did Putin go in when he did?
Okay. Yeah, I know, but I'm refuting his false accusation that the other side of the story is somehow falling for the lies or repeating the lies of the Russians when that has nothing to do with our conversation here. Okay, now that I'm done refuting that, I want to go back to your previous question about why they lied in the 1990s. In 1990, it was because the Soviet Union still existed, and they still had troops in Eastern Europe. The USSR did not finally fall until Christmas 1991. And so, of course, they had to tell the Russians what they needed to hear to get them out of the way, to get them to acquiesce. And they continued to lie. One of the greatest examples of this, you can read at Brookings by James Goldgeier, wrote all about this, was Warren Christopher in 1993. Went to Moscow and lied right to Yeltsin's face, told him again, we're going to do, this is when they replaced the CSCE with the Partnership for Peace, and said we're going to do the Partnership for Peace, and you and Ukraine will be equal partners in it. So in other words, Ukraine's neutrality will be guaranteed. There won't be a fight over Ukraine, and we'll all be partners together. And Yeltsin said, this is the greatest stroke of brilliance. Tell Bill, I'm so enthused, et cetera, et cetera. And then he come to find out in the beginning of '94 that Clinton announced that, psych, we didn't mean that. We're actually going to expand NATO at your expense anyway. And yes, they did browse and complain all through the 1990s, including, you notice he just skipped 1999 when they did the first round and brought the first three nations into NATO. They launched the aggressive war against Serbia the same week or 2 weeks later, and proving that it's not just a defensive alliance. And the Russians went completely crazy. And all of America's best friends in the Russian establishment, people like Chubais and Gaidar and all those who've been friends with Clinton and Gore, they said this is the worst thing that you could do. You're destroying the entire new warm relationship that we created, and we have no reason to do this. And he cited George Kennan, but let me add here, pardon me, I'm trying to talk fast for you here, but listen.
Let me read George Kennan.
Hey, pardon me, let me finish it real quick.
Oh, you're going to interrupt the moderator.
2/3 supermajority of the population of the Council on Foreign Relations was against NATO expansion. Okay? The entire population of the American embassy in Moscow was against it. The experts were against it. the very few powerful wonks and politically connected interests in the Clinton government overrode them and decided to do it anyway.
George
it wasn't
Kennan.
just Kennan and Pat Buchanan. It was many, including Paul Nitze and Robert McNamara and William Perry, the sitting Secretary of Defense at the time, said that they should not do this, and for one reason, because it'll unnecessarily provoke the Russians. They said the same thing in 2004 with the second round.
All right.
And they
Why
said
did
the
we do
same
it?
thing. And
In other words, if
why-
the argument was clear that it was
My
against
bad.
our own interest to expand NATO, what was the motive?
Well, it's public choice theory, right? It's
Shoot
some
me
interests
or
are
put the gun
satisfied.
down.
So one of the things that was a very big, two of the things that were extremely important, and this is all from the New York Times. This isn't conspiracy theory stuff, okay? This is pure just journalism out there. You can find it. I have all the footnotes. It
supposed
was
to look for
the,
this
the
guy.
major incentives pushing for it
I already
were
forgot his
Lockheed
name.
dollars and Polish votes. And the Republicans were attacking the Democrats for being weak on it, and they said, we're going to corner the Republicans on this issue in Illinois and Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of Eastern European Americans whose votes they wanted to get. And Bruce Jackson from Lockheed launched the Committee to Expand NATO and spent millions of dollars lobbying and whining and dining policymakers and Eastern European leaders to get everybody all on board to build the consensus for this thing, because simply his job was getting rid of fighter jets at American taxpayer expense. And again, there are books about this. There's a great article by Richard Cummings about it, and you can read about it in the New York
is this
Times.
go-
Bruce
is this a
Jackson,
Gish Gallop?
Lockheed, NATO expansion. It's in the New York Times.
Can we get
this is what the incentives were. It's called public choice theory. It means there's no national interest. There's just the individual interests of the men in charge. And in this case, we're talking about William Jefferson Clinton and his men. And they were terrible men, and they made terrible decisions. Now, we had to skip, and I know it's a long, complicated subject, but we skipped all the way to 22 and the current war. But just barely touching on 2014.
Because you're
And of
supposed to be
course,
debating the
skipping,
Ukraine war.
completely omitting the fact that America, for the second time in 10 years, spent tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars supporting a phony revolution against the elected
God.
government in Ukraine, in the Orange
Okay,
Revolution.
Take a moment to
Millions of
explain
people
what
were
you
there.
mean, Scott. For our listeners, what took place in 2014, the revolution, or the coup according to some, revolution according to others. Take a moment to explain that, would you please?
Well, it was essentially a street
guy
putsch. It wasn't
gets
exactly a
to
coup
talk.
like the general overthrew him and replaced him, but it was a right-wing putsch in the street led by the descendants of those who served Hitler in the war, in the OUN, in World War II. The direct descendants. I demonstrate this. Don't shake your head. I demonstrate this with absolute hard facts and the best
And
Holocaust historians.
who was
in my
overthrown
book.
and by whom was he
can't
replaced?
refute it. That's exactly who they were, was the right sector and the Svoboda Party are the direct descendants of those who served the SS in the Second World War. And they were the ones who led the putsch on American dollars to
And this
force.
guy
And by the way,
is,
let
like,
me say this, I
better
think it's
at
so
Russian
important.
propaganda
People said
than
that Paul
Russians. It's
Manafort
amazing.
was Russia's agent controlling Trump, and before that he was Russia's agent working with Yanukovych. But he was in fact representing America's interests, because Yanukovych was not so pro-Russian. Yanukovych wanted to sign the association agreement with the European Union, and Manafort's entire job working for him was trying to help him accomplish that. There's an excellent interview of Manafort, who I would disagree with about this stuff. You can watch this great interview with him with Patrick Bet-David, where he explains all this. And what happened was, and even Henry Kissinger, who you're writing a biography about, you might look this up, it's in The Guardian. Henry Kissinger said it was all Angela Merkel's fault because she played too hard of hardball. She wasn't willing to give easy enough loan terms. She was demanding too much austerity, and she, according to Henry Kissinger,
It's
was the one
Angela
who ruined the
Merkel's
deal.
fault.
And
So
once
Scott,
she ruined
the
the deal,
argument is that in 2014, a pro-Russian leader of Ukraine was overthrown by right-wing interests in Ukraine, cooperating with the United States funding and cooperating with right-wing interests in Ukraine. They overthrow a more or less pro-Russian leader of Ukraine and replace him with a pro-Western leader of Ukraine. That's the argument about 2014?
well, that's what I'm saying. This is what happened in the end of 2013 that got it kicked off. Was he refused to sign this EU deal?
I stated that correctly.
Yes,
Okay, and
yes,
Neil, so
essentially that's right.
quickly, 2014, Neil.
Well, let me add one sentence.
Scott, you've had
Let me add
plenty
one
of
sentence
time.
to the way you
Scott.
sum that up, okay? Which is, after the putsch was successful,
The putsch.
all former Ukrainian presidents signed a letter Kravchuk, Kuchma, and Yushchenko all signed a letter saying we must now just repeal the Kharkiv Pact and kick Russia out of the Sevastopol naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. Only then did Putin order his sailors and Marines to seize that peninsula in the coup de main.
Neil. By the way, boys, I'm going to insist on coming to the present next.
Indeed.
We're now in 2014. We're going to jump to 2024. Neil, go ahead.
Part of the problem with Scott Horton's argument is that the counterfactual lacks plausibility. Are you arguing that it would have been better for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that they didn't join NATO in the period of NATO enlargement? Would they have been more secure outside NATO? The striking thing about Ukraine's fate is precisely that it happened when it was outside NATO. It was the fact that it wasn't protected by Article 5 that left it vulnerable to Russian aggression. So one obvious lesson of NATO enlargement is that it certainly benefited those countries that were fortunate enough to become NATO members. Ukraine's
No, but you're begging the question. You're assuming that there was a threat to them at all.
You could let me finish.
Let Neil
One of the obvious problems about Ukraine's situation was that it was offered NATO membership, a path to NATO membership after 2008, but that was never sincerely intended, leaving Ukraine and Georgia in a kind of limbo with some possibility notionally of NATO membership, but no likelihood of its happening. And of course, both countries subsequently were the victims of Russian military aggression. So the first and obvious point is that if you're not in NATO, you're far more likely to be the subject of Russian military aggression than if you are in NATO. QED, it was eminently sensible for the Czechs, for the Poles, for the Baltic states to join NATO. And the counterfactual of a US policy that wouldn't have brought them into NATO is of obviously a much less stable Central and Eastern Europe. Secondly, to hear Scott Horton defend the Yanukovych regime, one of the most corrupt regimes to have emerged since the collapse of communism.
I didn't defend the regime at all. What are you talking about?
Well,
I did not defend the regime of corruption.
You argued, if I can finish, you argued that a Nazi revolution or putsch occurred against Yanukovych. But Yanukovych was overthrown in a popular revolution against his egregiously corrupt rule. I wonder, Scott, have you ever been to Ukraine?
No.
You see, it seems to me that that's one of the reasons that you're not really a terribly dependable authority on this subject.
Have you
been to Russia? Have you been to Russia?
Listen, that was a popular revolution by some Ukrainians against the interests of many others. Give me a break, dude.
Have you been to Russia?
You know what? These are all red herring arguments. You want to bring up a counterfactual?
Here's a counterfactual for you. The difference between us
married to a Russian
Hoover,
by the way.
Is Condoleezza Rice still at Hoover?
Which is fine.
Condoleezza Rice still at Hoover where you guys work?
I've spoken with the people who were directly involved in Euromaidan and the revolution that overthrew Yanukovych. And I can assure you that they are not
Dmitry Nazis. Did you interview Dmitry Yurash?
And the claim that they are Nazis, is of course another part of Russian propaganda that you see
meet with Andrei Perubi
on recycling in this conversation. So I'm sorry, somebody who's been to neither Ukraine nor Russia is not in a terribly strong position, no matter how many copies of the New York Times they've read.
That's ridiculous. That's nothing but a red herring argument, as are all your arguments. I didn't defend Yanukovych about corruption. That wasn't addressed. What I said was he wanted to move to the West. He was not Russia's puppet. That doesn't mean he was a good man. He hired Manafort to help him move west, but the West botched the negotiations. That's what I said. No one but you heard me defend Yanukovych. Isn't that funny? Also, here's for a counterfactual. Our current CIA director was the ambassador to Moscow in 2008 when he explicitly warned Condoleezza Rice not to give a membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. And anyone can read it at WikiLeaks. It's a famous memo. It's called Niet Means Niet. And it's by William Burns. And he's saying to her, this is the brightest of red lines. The Russians, everyone in Russia disagreed. He says he's not just talking to Lavrov, he's talking to everybody at all the think tanks and all the experts, and they're all saying this is going to cause a war. Lavrov said, if you bring Ukraine into NATO, it could cause a civil war. This is our current CIA director who failed to prevent this. said the Russians said, if you do this, it could
I was
cause a
told I can
civil
turn
war in
off
Ukraine, and which would be a
automatic.
situation that they would be forced to make a choice
I
whether
think
to
you'll agree,
intervene. A decision
Scott,
they do not
it
want
wasn't a
that to
civil
do.
war that happened in Ukraine.
And she
it was an
did not
invasion
listen.
by a neighboring
Jesus
country,
Christ.
which is a slightly different thing.
She ignored his advice, and she gave a membership action plan, or a half-assed one, because the Germans and French did everything they could to try to stop her and Bush. So they compromised and gave this halfway offer, as you said. But it's such a circular argument,
God damn it.
question-begging argument to say that, oh, if only we just brought Ukraine into NATO first, then we would have just not had a problem. No, Russia just would have invaded them then. Because I'm
God.
telling you, and this is in the book, I cite this, I got more footnotes than you've ever seen in your life, and direct quotations from American experts from the 1990s
guy's
through the
so cringe with his
2000s, through the
footnotes.
2010s, and into the 1920s, including your beloved
articulate your
Kissinger and Zbigniew
argument better.
Brzezinski and all of the very top graybeards saying that, and including Ken Pollack, who
Graybeards, this is
helped you
his,
lie us into war with
insult.
Iraq back 20 years ago. They all said
He's the only guy here
Ukraine
with the gray
itself
beard.
is the absolute touchiest of issues. The most neuralgic issue is what Burns said, because there is a massive ethnic Russian population in the East. It used to belong to Russia in a way that Latvia and Estonia never truly did. They were like occupied imperial possessions, but they are a separate ethnicity and have a different
think
history.
about what you're
whereas
saying, my friend.
Novorossiya is so tied to Russian history. It's an extremely touchy subject, and it has been since independence. And they all recognize that, and they all warn against it. And at various times, Kissinger, Brzezinski, Ken Pollack, and
Why
all
are
these
you
other
defending
Council on
an
Foreign Relations
like a
guys
blatantly
said we ought to make a separate deal
imperialist
regarding
project?
Ukraine. We ought to promise never to bring them into NATO. We ought to guarantee their permanent neutrality. Kissinger wrote this in the Washington Post in 2014. And then that will avoid picking this fight. Now you say, well, if only we'd given them a war guarantee earlier, there never would have been a fight. But that's not true. There just would have been a full-scale war earlier, because the Russians were never going to accept that. That's the fact.
Well, the reality, of course, Scott, is that the Russians were in no way able to go to war with NATO, and they consistently avoided going to war with NATO for a very good reason. They were entirely outmanned and outgunned by NATO, but they could go to war with Ukraine. Now, let's grant that there was a meaningful debate about whether or not Ukraine should be offered NATO membership. The same argument was made about Georgia. And that debate went on within US policy circles before, during, and after 2008. And as you rightly say, Henry Kissinger was one of those who was skeptical about the idea of making Ukraine a NATO member, though he later changed his mind about that. And the reason he changed his mind was, of course, that Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, I don't think anything that you've said so far has persuaded me, or I suspect anybody listening, that Russia was right
That's
and
the gun you're supposed
justified
to
in
use.
launching
Okay,
a war.
where's
Well,
this
that's not
artifact?
my argument. So,
Well, it does
Nice
sound a
try.
little bit like it. Because
no, that's
if it wasn't-
ridiculous. Again, you've done nothing but tilt at windmills this whole time. You make up
Actually, Scott-
counterfactuals that I never said. You make up
Scott,
quotes I
please,
never
actually,
said.
Scott.
You call me Russian propaganda. You
Actually, Scott, you've
go ahead and
echoed a lot
actually
of Russian
argue with
propaganda
something
on
I
this
said, or
program.
go home and take a nap.
So the question I'm asking you is, even granting that there were good arguments against Ukraine becoming a member of
Up
NATO,
talking, you sound like a little girl. You have to
What?
go up in your inflection at the end of
What,
every
dude,
sentence
what
like
the
that.
hell?
That's really
Please
off
let him
putting.
ask a
debate
question.
strategy.
Go ahead.
It's
I'm
just
just
it's
showing
just
as much
an admission
patience
that you.
as I can with
Oh, what
a rather
the fuck?
juvenile debater. If you grant all of this,
Seriously,
it doesn't
juvenile.
make Russia's invasion of Ukraine legitimate any more than, say, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was legitimate.
I didn't say that.
Unless you're going to argue that this was a
didn't.
justified invasion, what exactly is your position? Were we wrong to resist it? Were we wrong to support Ukraine in defending itself against invasion? What's your position on that? I don't understand.
Well, you know, you wrote this article in Bloomberg News,
gonna
Putin
dodge
and
the
Biden
question.
misunderstand history in the Ukraine war, that came out in March of 2022, where you said, you quoted David Sanger from the New York Times, and you also cited all your own sources, and I'm paraphrasing here, anyone who's anyone in Washington and London knows that the goal here is to lock Russia into a long-term engagement in Ukraine at the expense of the people of
started this?
Ukraine's lives in
we
order
did
to
with
weaken
Taku.
Russia.
Right.
That's your great article. We've all cited it
So
so
what is your
many
position?
times. You wrote in here that prolonging the war runs the risk of not just leaving tens of thousands of Ukrainians dead and millions homeless, but also of handing Putin something that he can plausibly present at home as victory. Betting on a Russian revolution, which is what they were saying, yeah, we're going to win this war and it's going to weaken Russia and his government's going to fall. And you said betting on a Russian revolution is betting on an exceedingly rare event. Even if the war continues to go badly for Putin, if the war turns in his favor, there will be no palace coup. And so you were cautioning against extending the war. You explained in here, you said this explains why Joe Biden is so quick to level the accusation that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, meaning to preclude the chance of peace negotiations, to prevent peace from taking place. Isn't that right?
This doesn't change anything about the question I asked you, which is, do you think we were wrong to support Ukraine in its war of self-defense?
I'm just agreeing with you, agreeing with me here, that of course it was wrong.
You're
because it's not-
diametrically opposed to me.
You just explained that this isn't a war of self-defense. It's a war of America bogging down Russia to weaken and break Russia. You're the source for it, sir. What are you talking about?
Scott, you're
That's nothing to do with
very
defending
nice of you to
Ukraine.
quote me, but the point
Ukraine
I
are
made in
the
that
cannon
article,
fodder in this war.
article, which was, you say, was published early in the war, was that the war should be ended as soon as possible
know where this artifact
in the
is?
circumstances that were favorable to Ukraine in 2022. But this doesn't alter the question that I'm asking you. Are we wrong to have supported Ukraine in its war for its independence against Russian aggression?
Yes,
Well,
because
you're
we
assuming the
started
premise that history begins on the 24th when the Russian tanks roll in, and then what should we do then? But why do you get to frame it that
Usually
way? The
invasions
question
do have a date, and we all know the date when the Russians invaded Ukraine.
we also
Question
all know
is,
the date.
are you arguing that we should simply have let them roll over and take control of Kyiv?
I'm arguing that Joe Biden should have engaged in diplomacy throughout the year 2021 and into 2022 instead of the policy that they adopted,
was the
which was to
diplomacy?
warn Russia, you better not, but not to engage in any official real diplomacy to try to end the war.
So
And they refused to negotiate even the potential of neutrality for Ukraine. They have this concept. It's just jargon. It doesn't mean anything. It's called the open door. And that means that if a country wants to join NATO, that's between them and NATO, and no other nation's interest can ever be taken into account, no matter what. And so even though you, and I agree with something you said earlier in the debate, where you said they never truly intended to bring Ukraine into NATO. But in other words, a real war guarantee. But what they did do was arm them up. You talked about Ukraine arming up like it happened magically or they did it themselves. It was the Obama and the Trump governments and then the Biden governments that armed them up.
No.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up because
What did Obama
you're
give
right
them,
that it was
other
not
than
enough to
night
deter
vision
Russia.
goggles and
And in
blankets?
fact, at the beginning of the war, a
was
great
Trump that
journalist
gave them
named
javelins.
Zach Dorfman, who wrote this in-depth series about the CIA in Ukraine for Yahoo News, he quoted CIA officers who were in charge of importing those weapons from the United States into Ukraine in the I'm not sure about at least late Trump and into the Biden years. Pardon me.
But clearly Ukraine needed
Wait, just
weapons.
because I
So that it
stopped
was-
to
so
drink a
that it was
Dr. Pepper
Trump.
doesn't mean you get to jump in here.
I'm
These
going to jump
CIA
in. Scott,
These CIA
yeah,
officers
seriously.
told Zach Dorfman that they warned their bosses to warn the politicians that you have miscalibrated. By pouring these weapons in, it's not enough to deter Russia, but it is enough to provoke them. It's enough to make them feel like it's now or never, which is what you said. That was why Russia invaded, because Ukraine was building up and it was now or never. But it was America that was building them up and putting them in the situation where it was now or never.
To
And
be able
that's
to
why you
defend
admitted that
themselves
part of it
from
is it was
Russia
foreign intervention
as
that
they were
made it
trying
that
to
way.
become independent
We've spent
and
now
integrate with the
3/5 of our
European
time
Union.
on antecedents on before the war.
Now is the time to take advantage of the power
so
of
sorry
gold and silver
for the
to
ad.
grow your wealth. Whether you're an
Look,
experienced investor
I don't
or
think you
new
should
to the
buy
game,
gold or silver.
These precious metals have a
I
long
think you
history
should
of being
buy
a safe
Ripple
haven for your
coin.
savings, but they also offer growth potential, making them a wise investment choice.
Bitcoin.
So where does the average investor go to buy gold and silver? That's easy.
I could give you a
JM
list
JM Bullion is one of the
good
most popular
cryptos to
and most
buy.
trusted precious
And
metals retailers in the nation. We offer a huge selection of gold, silver, platinum,
just
and
a better
palladium
investment.
products that can be
Gold's-
delivered to your door in
you
safe,
might-
discreet, fully insured packaging. From 1 gram of gold to an entire mint box of silver, JM Bullion offers precious metals to suit every financial goal and budget. No matter your budget,
I'm really
now
just
is
trying
the
to find the
time to
entrance to
start
that
investing
cave
in
so I
precious
can
metals and start protecting yourself and your
find this.
savings
I'm
against
just gonna
these
walk
volatile
around
markets.
over and over and over
Visit
again. I've already played this.
jmbullion.com today to take
I've
a look at
already
our
played this
wide
one.
variety of precious metals, rounds, coins, and bars, and find out how you can turn your savings into gold.
Yeah, you just buy
The
gold
Russians
with your savings.
invaded
It's
in February of
pretty easy to do.
2022.
The question
Since
is,
then, the United States has given
how much is
Ukraine
that gonna
$60 billion in military
wealth?
assistance. These have to be round numbers, but these are the best I could find.
wanna
And
give
over
it
$100 billion in
1.5x?
economic and humanitarian aid.
sorry.
Too much or too little? Scott?
Well, look, the whole thing should be called off immediately. We need to negotiate. The high watermark of Ukraine's effort here was in September of 2022, when they had their brilliant feint in Kherson. They retook half of Kherson, and they retook essentially all of Kharkiv then. It has been all downhill from there. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mullen, and the current, at that time, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, both said, now's the time to negotiate while you're only this far behind. The rest of the establishment, the White House, and the media, they all said, no, no, no. As much as it takes, for as long as it takes, until Ukraine is restored to 2013 borders, including Crimea and the rest, which was always an absolute pipe dream. And by pursuing that, with the failed escalation of 2023 and the absolute grind of a war that's taken place in the Donbass, they've done nothing but lose territory since then. And the Americans do nothing but insist that they lower their conscription age and lower the age at which they send new cannon fodder, into battle to die in a losing war. And people can dress this all up as virtue. We can't abandon our friends and all these things. But that was what they said about Afghanistan for 20 years. We're backing this Afghan national government and its army, the Tajik and Hazara and Uzbek coalition, to keep the Pashtun Taliban out. But it didn't work. And we got hundreds of thousands of people killed, and in the end, lost the war anyway. And that's the same thing that we're doing here. It's the same thing that happened in Vietnam. These ATACMS missiles aren't game changers against Russia.
Vietnam, brother.
And so I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but unless you're willing to actually lower the conscription age to 18 and do mass conscription and send them all to the front, which they're not willing to do because they're facing a terrible demographic crisis right now. They're only sending middle-aged men to the front to fight. They're not willing to risk their young men. And Lindsey Graham demands that, no, lower the age. Send younger and younger men over there to die in a war that they've already lost. The question now, gentlemen, is whether the Russians are going to take Kharkiv and Odessa, or whether we're going to be able to negotiate a peace before it gets that bad.
Neil, this is you in a recent interview. I'm quoting you, Neil. It's not very easy to see how Ukraine can get Russia out. So it's important that we get an armistice. And the analogy I would use is with the Korean War, close quote. Neil, could you explain yourself on that one?
Well, I argued from very early on, in fact, even from the first month of the war, that it might well be understood as the Korean War of our Cold War, the first hot war, really, that clarifies the true geopolitical lie of the land. We got this far in the debate without anybody mentioning that Russia's war effort would not have been sustainable without large-scale economic support from China, as well as weapons from Iran, and now weapons and men from North Korea. So an axis of sorts has formed in support of Russia's war effort. And on the other side, Ukraine has been supported not only by the United States, but actually European Union countries have delivered more in financial terms, though not in military terms, to Ukraine than the United States. So the parallel with the Korean War was that you have a year of very kinetic warfare and then something like attrition and stalemate. And that's been, to some extent, true until really US aid was cut off, which caused a significant deterioration of Ukraine's position in that 6-month period. Now, Scott, who likes getting hot under the collar, will be surprised, perhaps he stopped reading my columns to realize that we agree that the war's prolongation after 2022 was a major error. The Biden administration's made a succession of mistakes. The first one was to fail to deter Putin in 2021. And the second one was not to end the war in 2022. We don't disagree about that. The issue really is whether the new Trump administration will be able to end the war when the balance of military advantage is clearly tilted in favor of Russia. It's very hard to get people to negotiate an end to a war if one side is clearly winning. And this is the legacy that the Biden administration has left to Donald Trump and his national security team. As I go every year to Ukraine, and therefore know the country rather better than Scott,
Dude,
I can assure you that the mood is extremely bleak in Kyiv right now, and it has been really for most of this year. There's a great deal of bitterness that the Biden administration encouraged the 2023 counteroffensive, but didn't supply the wherewithal for it to succeed. Peter, you asked, have we given too little or too much?
Correct.
Ukraine, the answer is very simple. Too little for them to win. Just enough for them not to lose, but now actually not even that much. And in a desperate attempt to correct matters, restrictions are being lifted on the use of ATACMS and Storm Shadows, but it's too late because the potential targets were long ago moved by the Russians out of range. So although Scott likes getting angry, actually we agree on this. I think the Biden administration has bungled this, and it's succumbed to the delusion that it was in American interest for the war to be prolonged. Whereas I think Kissinger understood before his death that in any case of this sort, when there are very, very unequal competence, and remember, Russia is in economic terms 11 times larger than Ukraine. In those circumstances, you've got to get the war over as soon as you can, really, and it should have been ended by negotiation in 2022. It's much harder now.
So, Neil, back to the North Korean analogy extremely briefly. There's an armistice in Korea, and all these decades later, South Korea is a rich, democratic country. It has never been able to reunify the country. But if something like that happened in Ukraine, that is to say, there were a settlement, the Russians under the settlement keep Crimea and about a fifth of Ukraine proper, a fifth of non-Crimean Ukraine, and 2 decades from now, 3 decades from now, we look at Western Ukraine, including Kyiv, and say, here's a country that's prosperous, that's democratic. That would be a victory, correct?
It would be a victory by analogy with the Korean case, but the nightmare scenario is that Ukraine ends up being South Vietnam, not South Korea. In other words, it's not in a sufficiently strong state at the end of the peace negotiations to survive a second phase, or I suppose third phase of Russian aggression. And that will mean that a lot depends on what kind of security guarantees provided to Ukraine. I think it's highly unlikely that NATO membership will be the way that this is resolved. The Trump administration has many members that think that way. But it's still possible for Ukraine to have some of the kind of security guarantees that South Korea had. After all, South Korea is not a member of NATO. This NATO issue we began with is important. Peter, if I may just make one point. Scott regards this as a sort of flashpoint and a major reason why war happened. Finland, of course, is now a member of NATO, one of the unintended consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Finland is in many ways as big a problem from a Russian vantage point as Ukraine. Scott, are you expecting Vladimir Putin to attack Finland next, now that it's been part of NATO enlargement?
Well, I certainly hope not. It's clearly could be construed as an offensive threat to them. And
but
why?
You realise why it won't happen, don't you? And the reason is that it's a NATO member.
I can't hear you when you're trying to talk over me. Were you going to put more words in my mouth? Go ahead and try.
My point is just that the reason it won't happen is that Finland is a NATO member. And Ukraine's problem, as I said before, was that it was never a NATO member, and that's what made it vulnerable.
Anyway.
Scott,
question. That's fine. Wait a goddamn minute. Listen, Russia never invaded Finland this whole time. We just brought what they would have, but we just brought them into NATO last year. We just brought them into NATO last year, and Putin said when America brought Finland in, they asked him, he said, listen, we're against this, and it does create new strategic problems for us. On the other hand, we don't have an ongoing border dispute with Finland. We don't have nearly complicated politics in dealing with Finland as we have in Ukraine. Ukraine is an entirely different issue. In Finland, the danger is Western military forces being based there. but there's no ongoing crisis as far as, for example, millions of ethnic Russians whose liberties are being threatened on the other side of the border, as was the extremely complicated and dangerous situation in Ukraine. So
Just for the
again,
record,
you're just always begging the question. Listen,
there was no threat to the rights of ethnic Russians in pre-war Ukraine.
That's not true. That is not true. That is not true. And I document in the book the myriad ways in which the Russian language and Russian speakers were being persecuted. Their language was being
Why did the civilian population of eastern Ukraine not welcome the Russians then? Why did they fight them? I'm sorry, I'm not following you.
Well, there's no such thing as the people of Eastern Ukraine. There are many people in Eastern Ukraine who absolutely did.
Many dead people in Eastern Ukraine thanks to your friends, the Russians.
Keith, my friends, the Russians, you're pathetic. Listen, Keith Gesson, my friend from the New York Times, was there and witnessed hundreds of thousands of people vote yes on independence in 2014. And it wasn't because he loves Russia. It was because they felt that they were being attacked, militarily attacked by their own, what they thought was their own national government protection force in Kiev. And so they were turning to others.
The staggering thing about this conversation is your almost total ignorance of Ukraine. I'm really wondering why we're bothering having it.
What's amazing is you don't know anything about what I know about Ukraine. And what's really amazing is that somebody like you...
Take a trip there, Scott. How about take a trip?
Gentlemen. The war in Iraq, a British imperialist who said that we need to get 7,000 Americans killed in Iraq for your interest is allowed to show his face in public and argue public policy anywhere, ever.
Scott, we're coming to the end. We have
I bodied your wife in front of everybody.
We have 6 minutes left. Scott, question for you. What kinds of guarantees? Donald Trump has said again and again and again that he wants to end the war. He even said at one point he would end it even before taking office. It seems clear, although if you want to attack this premise, feel free. It seems clear, as I look at it, that the United States would have to engage in some offer of military guarantees, economic guarantees to make the Ukrainians feel that they could settle with the Russians. To what extent should we be willing, should the Trump administration be willing to provide guarantees, economic and military guarantees to Ukraine?
Seriously.
Scott.
No.
Or to put it another way, how should Donald Trump settle this?
Well, Mr. Ferguson was right that the Russians are in a position of strength, which is going to make it very difficult for Trump, and who has surrounded himself with hawks. Marco Rubio is going to be the Secretary of State, for crying out loud. So I don't know what luck they're going to have trying to resolve this. There have been plenty of reasonable proposals put together by very distinguished gentlemen, far more credentialed than myself, that would say that they would have a permanent guarantee of neutrality in their constitution. They would be allowed EU membership, but not NATO membership. And I don't know what security guarantees European countries might be willing to give, but America should not give security guarantees to anyone. You know, back 20 years ago in a debate with Robert Kagan at AEI, Mr. Ferguson said, well, if the American people can't afford the war in Iraq, we'll just have to cut benefits for Medicaid and Medicare in order so that we can build up our military force. And in fact, America is bankrupt, and we have a Brit telling us we got to cut our welfare programs for our elderly people so that we can afford militarism. That war wasted between $5 and $8 trillion. Now the national debt is $36 trillion. The interest on the debt is $2 trillion per year. I'm talking to guys from the Hoover Institution. Let me lecture you guys a little bit about
Scott, I'm asking you a question about what Donald Trump should do
a world empire, Mr. Ferguson. We can't afford it. If you want a world empire, you should get the British to go invade the planet again.
Colossus, which argues clearly that the United States is not likely to be able to manage a world empire. But my question for you, Mr. Horton, is: should the United States have provided troops to South Korea? Should it have provided a military presence in post-war Japan? Should the United States have contained the Soviet Union during the Cold War? Was that also a mistake?
Always truncating the antecedents. It was the South that started the Korean War with American help. And this is documented. I forgot what's his name. The great scholar of the Korean War.
I think Noam Chomsky had changed his name to Scott Horton.
No, please. People can search at antiwar.com. Justin Raimondo has the review of the historian's book. I forget his name off the top of my head, but it's the great historian of the Korean War, who shows how America was supporting South Korean forces doing attacks across the border.
The invasion of South Korea.
Jesus.
And any serious historian of the Cold War will tell you that if you trouble to read their work.
Okay.
I'll refer you to John Gaddis.
Neil, this is you once again in that recent interview I quoted earlier. I'm quoting you, Neil. If we are to make sure that Putin is not only stopped in Ukraine but stopped altogether, there has to be a real and serious effort by the European members of NATO to get not just to 2% of GDP, that's on defense spending, but to 3.5%, close quote. So, an amendment of the question I've just asked Scott. What should the Trump administration be willing to offer, so to speak, to get this settled? But also, is there not an opening here for the Europeans to step up and provide us a way to shift our attention to China? But Scott said earlier that Trump has surrounded himself by hawks. I quote J.D. Vance in 2022, quoting J.D. Vance, "I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or the other." Neil, what should Trump offer and what should the Europeans do?
Nice.
It's worth adding that J.D. Vance,
One
in
thing
a
to
recent
be
interview
like-
with the New York Times, changed his position.
One thing to
and
be like,
made the
I'm
point
sorry,
that
we
it
can't
would be
help,
quite
but to
wrong
say, I don't give a
if
fuck
Russia were allowed
what
to
happens.
take Ukraine.
It's a little
Ukraine
malicious.
must, in fact, not be handed over to Russia. So his position has shifted. Clearly, the Europeans are at least a decade away from strategic autonomy. It will take them a very long time to rebuild their eroded defenses and defense industrial complex. The ultimate goal, and this is something that President Trump's long argued for, but he's not the first president to make the argument, must be for there to be meaningful burden sharing so that the costs of NATO are not disproportionately shouldered by American taxpayers. That's long been my position. And I think Donald Trump has already moved Europeans quite some way down that road. But it would be wrong, indeed it would be a delusion to imagine that the Europeans can provide sufficient deterrence in the short run to prevent a third Russian war of aggression against Ukraine at some point in the near future. This isn't going to get settled, Peter, in the sense of there being a full peace agreement. An armistice is, I think, the most likely outcome, a ceasefire. And in that ceasefire, I think it's highly likely that Russia will remain in control of somewhat less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. But I don't think the Ukrainians will be obliged to recognize that as a legitimate annexation, nor should they be, because the international order has to be based on something other than the kind of right of might that Scott Horton has in mind.
Hey, everybody.
We can't let the invasion of Ukraine be acknowledged as legitimate any more than we could let the invasion of
Please write something in the chat
Kuwait
if you
be
can hear me. I don't know
recognized
if
as legitimate.
I don't know if the
United
microphone's
States will
working or
therefore
not.
have to help Ukraine with its defenses, just as it helps Israel and has long helped Israel with its defenses. Otherwise, Ukraine, like Israel, will be menaced by superior hostile forces. So this is the simple reality, and it's nothing to do with empire. My book, Colossus, argued that America was not likely or able to run an empire, but it is the basis of American primacy. And we must want American primacy to endure in Europe as well as in Asia. The United States has to prioritize. It faces a hostile axis of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They threaten American interests in multiple locations. The new Trump administration will prioritize, I feel sure, China over these other threats because China is by far the biggest and most dangerous. But he can't walk away from Ukraine, as Scott Horton seems to imply, because the complete collapse of Ukraine, victory for Putin's aggression, would be a very, very dark day for European and indeed for global security. The question for you, Mr. Horton, is who would be next? We have quite some experience in European history, if you study it, of aggressive authoritarian regimes invading countries. And if you do nothing, as we did, of course, in 1938-39, when it was the partition of Czechoslovakia that happened, what happens is not surprising. They invade somewhere else, and sooner or later you do have the nightmare of World War III. So deterrence, peace through strength, is crucial to what the Trump administration has to do, and that must include deterring Russia from any further aggression against Ukraine.
All right,
Scott,
couple things here. Mr. Robinson.
I just wanted to say we're pretty much, we're nearly out of time. Closing statement, Scott.
Yes, sir. I'll try to be quick here. First of all, I have one correction. I made an error in the heat of my argument there. Mr. Ferguson and his friends got 4,000 Americans killed in Iraq, not 7. 7 is from Iraq and Afghanistan, which I know he supported as well. And it's funny that you say we should call it primacy, not empire, because in July of 2003, in your big debate with Robert Kagan at AEI, your entire point was that we should dispense with all the euphemisms like primacy and predominance and hegemony and just go ahead. The American people must embrace empire. It worked for the British. It was fantastic. And I'll be posting that. And where you say the American people, they'll just have to take cuts to their elderly pension programs so that we can afford militarism in the Middle East and your giant failed progress in Mesopotamia. I'll be posting that on my Twitter feed so everyone can read it, where 2003 you is mocking 2024 you for using euphemisms like primacy. And in fact, you even say, I reread it this morning, you even say in there, of course, George Bush shouldn't call it empire. When we're addressing the public, we should always use these euphemisms. But between you and me, Bob Kagan, we know what we're doing here.
Scott, you're talking about something that happened 20 years ago. Could you give us a closing statement on the present?
I'm an American. I'm an American, and I truly resent British people coming over here.
I'm also an American, Scott. I'm a U.S. citizen.
Well, nominally, but you represent.
Oh, really? You're going to call my question? You're going to call my nationality into question and my naturalization into question? That's fun.
Well, everything out of your mouth is against America's interests, so I don't know why anyone would listen to you.
I don't think it's in America's interest to hand Ukraine to Russia, which is what you seem to want to do.
You thought it was a great idea for America to hand Baghdad over to Ayatollah Sistani, right?
Well, I mean, you can look at the Middle East and draw your own conclusions about how well
exactly. Anybody can.
Work.
Anyone can see what you did in Iraq. You and your buddy Bob.
Gentlemen, reduced to talking about Iraq tells me you've lost the debate on Ukraine.
No, I was just making a correction about how many people you killed there. On the question of
closing statement on Ukraine, Scott, because we are out of time.
Go ahead. It's a rather small number by comparison with the number of Ukrainians Russian aggression has killed.
All of the. There are 37 million people driven out of their homes by the terror wars. At least 4 million people killed, according to the Cost of War Project at Brown University. You're absolutely wrong about that. There's still war going on in Somalia and all across the Middle East. And anyway, on the question of Ukraine, Mr. Robinson, you and the rest of your audience will notice that the Hawks never have any actual specific details about what they want to see happen. They always resort to these slogans about, we just can't give in.
What do you want to see happen?
We cannot let Putin win. But I'm asking, what's your plan? Because the fact of the matter is, to drive Russian forces out of Ukraine would take American Navy and Marines and Army to drive them out. I don't even think the Poles and the Germans plan.
Neil has already suggested his plan, which is an armistice for now. Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, but he also says they cannot be allowed to win and they cannot be allowed to take what they've taken. So which is it?
But the armistice doesn't give any formal recognition to the Soviets. It simply puts off for possibly decades. His analogy was Korea, which is...
You should look it up.
Right. So what is your plan, Scott? Closing statement. We are over time now.
Well, pardon me then for the mistake. If you're truly saying that, no, the policy of trying to reverse what's happened in the invasion so far should be abandoned, then I agree with you about that. If you're, as far as what security guarantees America should give to Ukraine after this, it should be none. America should read Kiev the facts of life, which are, there's nothing more that can be done for you in this situation. You guys need to come to peace. And by the way, here's one thing America definitely could do for Zelensky, and that would be to provide him some Marine Corps bodyguards, because he's surrounded. And listen, this is important. Nazis like Dmitry Yarosh and Andrei Parubi and Andriy Beletsky have threatened to murder Poroshenko and Zelensky repeatedly when they talk about trying to make peace. Zelensky tried to implement the Minsk II deal in 2019, and they threatened to murder him. And,
gentlemen, we're done.
And the New York Times said these are credible threats.
Scott, 60 seconds ago, I thought I heard a note of partial agreement. I'm going to latch onto that to close out this conversation. Scott Horton, thank you. Neil Ferguson, thank you. And to all our viewers, thank you for listening to the Zero Hedge debate, sponsored by JM Bullion. Thank you, everybody.
It was quite painful. That was like the Lavrov Tucker Carlson debate. Empire. Come on, bro. Our colonies. Our Ukrainian colony. So considering that, so what was the what companies have, there was this thing that I heard said that I think Zizek maybe even said this, of American companies have bought Ukrainian land. I think was the stealth takeover of Ukrainian agricultural land. So we can go to the first one. Should we probably go to the Ukrainian website? That's probably a good idea. Cargill bought 5% stake in the Ukrainian agriculture holding Ukraine land farming for $200 million. That's not very much money. Okay, that's very... Alright, what else? I'll go to this one. This one seems to be... sketchy, but we'll read it. Indigenous land rights. Okay. Admits chaos of war. A new report exposes the stealth takeover of Ukrainian agricultural land. 1 year into the war, a new report reveals how oligarchs and financial interests are expanding control over Ukraine's agricultural land with help. Check. With help and financing from Western financial institutions. Aid provided to Ukraine in recent years had been tied to a drastic structural adjustment program requiring the creation of a land market through a law that leads to greater concentration of land in the hands of powerful interests. Ukraine's crippling debt is being leveraged by financial institutions to drive post-war reconstruction towards further privatization and liberalization in several sectors, including agriculture. Liberalization? That's a red flag. Ukrainian civil society, academics, and farmers are demanding the suspension of the land law and all land transactions and calling for an agricultural model no longer dominated by oligarchy and corruption. Okay, can I have some facts? Can I have some numbers, please? No, this is just like not hearsay. This is just like a theory, or there's a report. There's a report. Let's check it out. War and theft. The takeover of Ukraine's agricultural land. I'm looking for numbers. Several agribusiness still largely controlled by oligarchs have opened up the Western banks and investment funds, including prominent ones such as Kopernik, BNP, or Vanguard, who now control part of their shares. Most of the large landholders are substantially indebted to Western funds and institutions, notably the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank. Okay. Western financing to Ukraine in recent years has been tied to a drastic structural adjustment program that has required austerity and privatization measures, including the creation of a land market for the sale of agricultural land. President Zelensky put the land reform into law in 2020 against the will of the vast majority of the population who feared it would exacerbate corruption and reinforce control by powerful interests in the agricultural sector. I wish that I could, okay, so it's just kind of like a accusation without any evidence. So the Sophia Globe, let's try this one. So this is like 8 months later. It is not true that GMO crops are being grown legally in Ukraine. Ukraine's parliament has never allowed foreigners to buy agricultural land. That right is reserved solely for Ukrainian citizens and companies owned fully by Ukrainians. The investment fund BlackRock was invited by the Ukrainian government to participate in the creation of a fund for the future rebuilding of the country after the war. The company has no right to purchase. So, and that is November 23. So the claim was made by Bulgaria? So, I'm pretty sure I heard Zizek claim at that Oxford debate recently. Zizek, Ukraine, Western companies buying land. Paywall. This is a Russian thing, but it's like I think it's a liberal Russian thing. What I don't want is Western triumphalism. I read that 1/3 of the best land is either in private hands or owned by a Western company. This is economic colonization. Okay, what is your proof, Zizek? Can I... He just read that. Yeah, I just read it too. And then I read something that debunked it. But, so it's contentious, but... Whoop. It's apparently illegal for... Where are you? Come at me, bro. Ooh, I can take his shit. Yeah, get fucked. Suddenly got dark. Would it be like that sometimes? You know, you go and you gotta hide out in the water tower if you want to read some shit, only to get I'm gonna get my sniper rifle. Hold on. We're gonna snipe some of these beasts, because those things are annoying, and I just don't want to... A lot of this game is really annoying. Dogs are annoying. These retarded, Come on, where's my... Who put that there? Where you at? Safe? Can I eat bread while I'm on the ladder? No. Okay, so, you know, I know that Zizek is, Kami. He's not like a tanky, but he's like Vosh. He'll just lie. I don't know if he'll just lie or... Bitch ass. But yeah, I guess he'll just lie. Because he really hates capitalism. People that hate capitalism lie about capitalism. This is what I've come to understand. I wonder if that's just like the simplest way to put it. Where's that guy? Fuck's sake. For fuck's sake. Where's the other guy? Where's your friend? Taking his shit. Aha. Gina Bushba. Fuckface. Where the bandits were hiding out. I think I'm gonna go back to Stalker, or Fallout. This guy's a fucking piece of shit. This guy's a fucking piece of shit. Dude, Eastern Europeans, what the fuck is the matter with you? What the fuck is the matter with you? There was a... Alright, let's watch this retard.
You described Peter's view, as he's outlined it there, as traumatic and intolerable and scandalous.
This is the highest praise that I can give unto somebody, my God.
We are rational beings in a sense that
No, we're not.
non-human animals generally are not, although I don't think it's a sharp distinction. I think there's a continuum. But certainly you would say some non-human animals are not rational beings. They're more instinctive or more moved by immediate emotions and desires. But I think with us, morality has a rational component. But what I think we're getting there is an insight into something that other rational beings, if they exist, would also see. So in that sense, I don't think morality is purely human either. I think if we had intelligent aliens coming to visit us, or maybe even super intelligent AGI, it would recognize some of our moral principles as being rationally defensible.
Okay, let's bring Slavoj in on this point. Slavoj, I came across a quote from you recently where you described Peter's view, as he's outlined it there, as traumatic and intolerable and scandalous. Whereas you're in your outline of your view, you seem very much on board with Peter and Nancy's opening remarks. So where is the point of disagreement?
Wait a minute. You totally misunderstood my deeply pathological worldview. The word that you use, scandalous, traumatic, this is the highest praise that I can give unto somebody, my God. People who are not these are boring, everyday idiots. I mean, all discovery works like this. I agree with both of you about this, that something like, okay, we don't have a better term, morality, reciprocity, even justice exists at a certain level.
I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back down in this vault. I don't have the.
High, from our standards, some highly developed animals. But nonetheless, I would say that was my not critical point, but simple observation that isn't it nonetheless that we humans are exceptions in precisely the sense that, again, precisely those who claim we are just among one of the species on the earth, they, under quotation marks, humiliate us like don't think you are the center, but at the same time they give us the privilege to act as universal agents, to take care, to have a responsibility also for the well-being, less suffering of all other animals.
You described vegetarians in a talk recently as degenerates.
Maybe that's more praise.
I wonder, again, is that more praise, or do you disagree that that's
I
the goal?
don't really love Zizek. There's things about him that I like, okay?
Sexuality, by definition, in some fundamental sense, degenerate. Because it's against veneration. Sorry, I never understood Catholic Church when they say the ultimate goal of sexual act should be giving birth. Sorry, animals are doing like this. We humans have something that we call love, passion, which is much more spiritual, where it's ridiculous to say, honey, we may enjoy it, but remember, we really are doing it for a child.
There's been a movement in the animal rights literature to not just argue that we owe non-human animals better treatment on our part, but to stop them from harming each other. Do you worry that this kind of rhetoric about reparations or stopping
I'm pretty sure this
animals
gun
from
just
harming
doesn't
each
work
other
anymore.
is counterproductive for the movement?
It's not that there isn't a lot of suffering in nature. I don't think we should revere nature. Clearly, nature is absurd in some ways, and species who produce hundreds or even thousands of offspring when nearly all of them are going to die. You know that on average only 2 of them are going to survive. Otherwise we'd be knee deep in frogs or fish or whatever species we're talking about. So yes, nature is incredibly wasteful, and you can certainly imagine trying to reduce the amount of suffering in it, but I don't think we really have much idea of how to do that, except maybe around the margins. We can try and you can stop your cat playing with a mouse, maybe, if you see that going on. You can try to install glass where birds are not going to fly into the windows. Some of those things will help nature. But actually to try to interfere with predator-prey relationships or with methods of reproduction seems to me to be far-fetched at this stage.
I don't know what's going wrong, because we should hate each other with Peter, but I more and more agree with you. You know what? Correctly, you must know
That's how I feel about
better.
you too, Zizek.
I think I read somewhere, correct me again if I'm wrong, that how Darwin began to doubt in
Zizek's the
God. In one
only
of these stupid islands
commie
that he
that's
visited in
like
Latin
joyful,
America, weren't there some turtles?
and that's what appeals.
Natural reproduction was they approached the coast, but they had to pass over a certain gap, and most of them fell wrongly down, turned on their back, and suffered because they couldn't turn around. Terrifying long suffering before they died. So there came some too aggressive ecologists who said, why don't we help them? So they hired locals to turn the turtles on their back. Yes, turtles survived, but their excessive survival ruined the whole balance of life in that part. You see, that's the tragedy. So, again, agreeing with Peter, I would say, be very careful here. We don't really know how something that may appear horrible to us.
I'm not sure you should
It
be.
may be a crucial part of how nature reproduces itself.
Got business?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.
Cringy cringe. What else we got? Let's find some other Ukraine debate. Do we want to listen to the rest of Sergei Lavrov and Tucker Carlson? God help us. That's an hour and 20 minutes. I don't think so. What? We pretty much already heard it for like Curb La Goop. Let's watch this guy do what he was doing.
Got killed by a boot? I don't even know what I got hit with. Looked just like a fucking MP3 player right there.
He's got fans. He's better than I am. Okay. What monster is that? I have not seen that guy before. He looks like a Fallout character, that little mole rat thing with the hands. Just need some tips and tricks. Behind you, bro.
Are you fucking serious?
Dude, where are you getting these guns?
He just picked up his body to throw it at me. Fat piece of shit.
Good stuff.
Where's the other one? Up here or something? Can't run by them. Dude, that did so much damage to me. Is there another one?
Assad really got hosed, huh? That was quick. Obviously gonna end up crazier than it already is.
Nah, those dudes can be annoying. There's still another one somewhere.
Alright, let's see who else is playing Stalker 2.
Where's he at?
Who else playing live? Oh, here we go.
There are a lot of things that you need to know in Stalker 2 that the game just doesn't really tell you. If you have any extra tips that I don't mention here, or anything to add on, like your favorite weapons, how to deal with some of these harder enemies, leave it down in the comments and I'm sure it'll help someone out. You get different scanners over the course of the game that I'm not going to spoil how or what they look like, but the default scanner in the game can be sort of confusing and finding artifacts in general can be hard at first too. The scanner is simple to use, the game just doesn't really tell you how to use it. It beeps when an anomaly is nearby and beeps faster as you move closer. Only some anomalies contain artifacts though, and if it does contain an artifact, it'll make a slightly different sounding beep and also emit that white light. If you don't see the light, there is no artifact. If you see the light, it'll be accompanied by a deeper sounding beep that goes faster as you get closer, just like the normal anomaly beep does, but the deeper one is getting faster based off how close you are to the artifact. To get the artifact and get it to show itself, you have to get to where the scanner is beeping as rapidly as possible and wait for the artifact to show itself. It's also sort of moving around. Like, the artifact is here when you can't see it. It's just invisible and sort of like floating in this same general area.
Superposition?
To take out your scanner,
it's
just make sure it's
floating.
inserted into the slot there so that you can swap to it, which you can do with the number 7 key, or just hold RB on controller or hold tab to select it from there. Artifacts being in an anomaly is really just RNG. So like at the ribs location is a gravity anomaly. For some of you, there will be an artifact there. For others, there will not. But it seems like saving nearby before you get to that location and reloading until it does pop up will work and let you force an artifact to eventually spawn. At least it seems to work sometimes. Speaking of radiation, if you're sitting around wondering why you're suddenly getting non-stop doses of radiation therapy and your radiation just keeps adding on no matter what you do,
container,
there's a good chance you just have too many relics with negative radiation effects. These do not give you resistance to radiation and instead give you radiation. So once you have too many on, you're just going to start getting smacked with radiation, and by just unequipping one or all of them will likely fix it. So yeah, if you didn't know, you can equip artifacts for different buffs, but you really only want to temporarily put these on whenever you need that buff, at least the ones that have negative radiation effects. Also, you can bypass the radiation that comes out of an artifact by making sure it's in the leftmost slot in your inventory, which puts it inside of a case so that the radiation doesn't leak. There are a couple of ways to increase your weight limit for the amount of weight that you can carry before becoming over-encumbered. Specific artifacts like the one called Stone Blood can increase your carry limit. This can be handy to just carry around in your backpack, and once you're over-encumbered, just smack it on and it'll give you a slight amount of radiation, but will also buff your weight capacity. You can get Stone Blood from those gravitational anomalies, like I found one here. That same one that I just went over at Ribs. You can do a similar thing with the consumable called Hercules. Pop that bad boy, and now you have 300 seconds or 5 whole minutes where you can carry an extra 20 kilograms. Weapons and armor both take up a good portion of your weight, and both of those can typically be upgraded to weigh less, as well as certain armor upgrades giving you an increase to carry capacity. Plus, some armor in the game just lets you hold more weight. Bloodsuckers have undergone a serious buff in this game, where in the first game they were still terrifying and hard enemies to take out, but holy crap man, their health and armor now are just insane. Luckily, there are a couple tricks that you can use to deal with them.
Oh my god.
There's usually an anomaly nearby, especially if it's story related, so if there is one, just bait them into it. It can be sort of harder to do sometimes, but it has worked for me once before. Enemy spawns are also RNG, so I've had luck just reloading a save and coming back to no Bloodsucker, and instead like the enemy will be dogs or something, but that's only if they're a random spawn in the world and the Bloodsucker isn't tied to like a mission. Plus I think some locations just specifically have a Bloodsucker lurking there. You can also typically just run completely past them. I've done this for like 2 different story related Bloodsuckers because there was just no credible way to kill them at the time. But I also do it for just any Bloodsucker I really see now, unless for some reason I just really can't escape. Because I mean, even when you have Bloodsuckers down pat, you know how to kill them easily, it is a huge waste of ammo, and then you're still going to get hit once in a while, so you're going through medkits too. There's also a mod that nerfs the Bloodsuckers and the Poltergeists to have 1/4 of their default health. I really think this is what needs to be implemented in the next update, because these guys are just insane, man. Also for Bloodsuckers, the best thing you can do is stagger them, and the easiest way to do that, especially early game, is a nice clean shotgun blast. The AK is also a good weapon to use, but this shotgun can be found early on in the game in the poppy field in the attic of a small house. It'll be inside of a chest up the ladder. And also with Bloodsuckers, you don't want to sit still and wait. You want to keep moving around, kind of strafe, by just doing short sprints and try to sidestep over before they reach you during their charge. And they have like an invisibility cloak, but you can still see them, or at least the blur of them, so that you can try to keep an eye out for them. They can miss their attacks pretty easily, and then it gives you a second to shoot them if you are kind of like side strafing. Or just shoot them while they're charging so that they'll get stunned and retreat, but that's sort of like hit or miss. I think it's really damage dependent on how much it stuns them. Ammo and weapons that deal more penetration or armor piercing damage seem to make a bigger difference, since these guys seem to be armored to the dang core. I've also heard that the knife is surprisingly good to use against Bloodsuckers, but I haven't tested it out too much, and the times that I have, it just wasn't working. I have tested the knife throughout the rest of the game with other enemies though, and yeah, it is surprisingly pretty dang good. But it's better if you use the heavy attack, which is the right click.
Yeah.
Both clicks look almost the same, but the right click is a lot stronger. And if you don't know what I mean by like side strafing, if you didn't know, you can't sprint side to side or backwards, but you can sprint going forward diagonally. On keyboard, you would just hold forward plus either the D key to go right or the A key to go left, and then press shift to sprint, and you can sort of sprint out of the way of enemies. Super basic stuff, but it's helped me out every now and then, especially when it comes to bloodsuckers.
Yep.
There is really no point in fighting mutants unless you have to. They give you nothing. No XP, no drops, nothing. It makes it sort of boring, but at the same time, it gives you an excuse to just run away. They clean you out of all of your ammo just for the satisfaction of saying, wow, that was a real fun bullet sponge fight that I got nothing out of.
Yeah.
So yeah, I said it for the bloodsuckers, but mutants in general, unless you just want to fight, or it's easier to shoot them and you have a lot of ammo, just run away. By the way, if you didn't know, headshots on human enemies are by far the best way to go. Headshots are almost always one shot unless they have a helmet and your weapon doesn't have a whole lot of penetration. But body shots, my god, dude, they eat rounds. These guys got like level 19 body armor on.
Yeah.
And that brings me to stealth. You might not even know this because enemies see you extremely easily, and I think it's almost more just being bugged with the stealth because they'll sometimes see you through walls, but you can do stealth takedowns with your knife. Just get close enough and you'll hold the knife differently, where you can then use a regular or heavy attack to take them down. If you take out a bolt that you can typically use for anomalies, you can actually use these to lure enemies out to either get them away or do a takedown. You just have to be quick because this isn't like most games where they're like, huh, what was that? Let me turn my back for 3 whole minutes. They're really only distracted for like a couple seconds in here. There's an achievement for taking out all enemies at a camp before the alarm is set off. If you come to this location in garbage next to the slag heap settlement, there's a camp with just one guy. Just take him out and you'll get the achievement. If you want to know how to fast travel, just look for this crosshair icon on the map. The sad part is, these crosshair icons only lie in large settlements, where you then need to go to that crosshair icon to talk to that NPC, who you can pay money or coupons to travel to another fast travel location at another settlement. You cannot just willy-nilly pick a spot on the map or open your map and fast travel to that icon. You have to already be at a fast travel location. So it's not as easy as most open world games, and you have to pay money or coupons, which makes fast traveling a lot harder to do early game, and I'm guessing that was intentional. You also don't really unlock fast travel until you progress through the story to where you get out of the lesser zone and into the garbage zone, and then just speak to the guide to unlock fast travel at the slag heap, the second big settlement that you come to. A good reason to fast travel back to past settlements, or at least something to keep in mind if you do fast travel back somewhere, is that prices at different traders, like
fast traveling is like the best part of Fallout. If it didn't have that, I probably wouldn't play the game.
Upgrade prices, for example, with technicians. Those are cheaper at some technicians than others. It seems to just depend on the upgrade. The personal stash or private box is like a Minecraft ender chest that can be used between all settlements, so you don't need to travel or fast travel all the way to your other private box. Every big settlement has one. Even the slag heap, the second big settlement that you come to right after you leave that lesser zone and get into garbage, it has a private box. It's just not marked on the map. You can find it right beside the trader named Huron.
We could join the Sultan at the swamps too. And if it gets real bad, we could always sign up with the Mercs.
The only bed that you can sleep in is the one marked at each big settlement, which sometimes lies right next to that private box. If you try to sleep and it tells you that you have ailments, take a look at the lower left hand of the screen, and if it's not radiation, you're probably just hungry. Eat and then you can sleep. But sleeping also just makes you more hungry. How much more hungry just depends on what time you went to sleep, since sleeping always just skips to morning. So if you don't have a lot of food, you might not want to sleep, since sleeping doesn't give you any buffs other than skipping past the game's terrifying nighttime that seems to drag on 10 times longer than the daytime. To repair weapons, all you have to do is look for a technician marked with this icon on the map, and this is the first one you will find in Cilicia.
Okay, I learned a lot. So it's been fun. I think I will finish doing stuff, but have a great evening. Thanks for all those I think those 8 viewers I had. There seems to be 1 viewer still. That's pretty cool. Good night to you, whoever you are. Take care of yourself.